A little bit out of my wheelhouse this time. My friend wanted me to paint this Skaven engineer from the Isle of Blood. I never painted a Skaven before, but I think these are cool models. I loved it when GW used to put exclusive models in the box sets. They're just neat alternative scopes. So I'll see if I can figure it out. I'm kind of winging this because I've never painted Skaven before, but I assume I'm going to be contrast heavy. I just get good results with it, so I'm going to start how I start almost all of my models and do a zenithal coating. This final layer right here is a dry brush of a pure white from Vallejo. And once I get this done and dry, we will figure out this model. So the first thing I'm going to do is the flesh on this rat. I'm going to use Fire Slayer flesh. That's a little bit too dark, so I'm going to mix it with this contrast medium here. Looking at what the studios from Games Workshop have been painting their Skaven lately, I feel like they've been overusing flesh tones a little bit and not a lot of fur. I kind of don't like that. I think a rat should look like a rat. I think it should be very fur heavy. So with my flesh, I just want to get just a little bit around his mouth, his hands, and his feet, and the rest of the Skaven should be fur. Obviously this one's mostly covered, so we're just going to have the rest of his face in fur, but that's how I'm going to do any other Skaven I paint going forward. This toned down Fire Slayer flesh worked out pretty good. I'm pretty happy with the color, and like I always do, I'm just working inside out. Get this flesh colored and go from there. Oh, and the tail. I can't forget the tail. Next up is the fur, and I did a terrible job of cutting this, but I'm going to use some Bacillium Gray. This is a contrast paint from GW. It's kind of a dark gray color. We're going to lighten it up with highlights. I looked in the lore to see what color to do to the fur for rats. Gray was more of like their high cancel, their warriors, but I couldn't find a color specifically for their engineering class. And I just made the assumption that these warp block engineers are more gray seer than anything else. So I went with the color of gray. Here I just went back through with the Fire Slayer flesh. Remember, I cut it down about 50-50. I'm just going to cut anywhere else that's still gray on that face, the lower part of the ear, the inside of the ear, a little bit more in the front of his mouth, just to make sure that's all done before I move on to the next step. Not having a lot of experience painting Skaven, I really wanted to amp up the mad scientist vibe. So I want to use a lot of coppers, a lot of bronzes, and when I use other metallic, I want to use this Iron Warriors. It gives me a dark iron base to work off of that I think is going to fit the theme of this rat very well, and you know, kind of hype up the 1920s evil scientist madman thing I feel the model's kind of going for. I'm going to use a lot of different colors for the copper parts for the bronze part, but for these eyes here, because they're such a textured surface, I'm going to go ahead and use this Hoplite Gold from Army Painter. It's a speed paint, and for fairly obvious reasons, speed paints aren't great for metallics. They have to have those metallics, shavings in them to make them that sparkle, but I don't know how, and I don't know why, but this color from Army Painter is actually really good, even if I wouldn't recommend their other metallic contrast. I think it just gives a nice color and does a good job of showing depth in raised areas, shadow. It's just overall solid color. My friend wanted the robes to be blue, so I'm going to use this Talisar contrast blue from GW. This is actually one of their better contrast paints. It's kind of a stretch to say all these contrast paints are good for one layer, but I mean, this color really is. It does the highlights, the depths really well with one thin coat. I really suggest anyone buys it, and it should help a lot with this miniature. It should have the robes looking really nice, at least until I dirty them up later. As you can see, I'm getting a nice variety of color here with the depth. Just really a phenomenal paint. So next I'm going to do the armor on his body using this Balthazar Gold. Like I said before, I do kind of want to hype up the mad scientist, early 1920s crazy look. And I do think the coppery bronze kind of colors work really well for that effect. So that's how I'm going to do his body armor. I'm just going to get a nice base coat of this nice color here, and then we'll go on to the next step. I want to get the back part of his backpack, the one in the shadows with this color, but I don't want to do the outer portion of his back piece. I want to do that in a brighter bronze, so I'm just going to be very careful here, get the back bits, and yeah, and just real carefully get the neck piece right here. Now I'm just going to wash over everywhere we put the Balthazar Gold with this Agrax Earthshade, just kind of tone it down a little bit, make it a little bit more grimy. So I want the Warpstone rune on his chest and that wire leading to it to stand out a little bit. So rather than sticking with the same kind of goldish bronze color I'm using for the rest of the armor, I'm actually going to hit this with some rune fang steel. It's a bit of a brighter silver metallic color that should help this piece of the miniature stand out a little bit. Okay, so moving on here, I'm gonna work on a staff. I'm gonna use a lead belcher. Originally I was gonna do this staff as wood, but then I seen all the wires going in and out of it. It doesn't make sense for it to be a wood staff. So we're going to do a metal staff to kind of hype up the mad scientist route. I just want it to be a little lighter than some of the dark armor I used on his body, just to make it stand out a little bit more. Okay, I'm going back to the Rune Fang steel here to do the main blade of his weapon. Normally this is a color I use for highlighting, and I do a darker metal for weapons, but with the rest of his pull already being metal, I wanted the blade to stand out a little bit more, so we're going a shade lighter than I would normally. We're just going to be very careful not to get into these ruins. I want to give them a kind of a warpstone glow, excuse me, a little bit later. So we're just going to use the side of our brush and not get into any depth in the runes, and just cover the rest in this color. And going back to the Balthazar gold, I'm going to do little metal bits on his sword where, you know, his electronics are housed. In this color, again, this will tie it back to the rest of the model and keep with the theme of, you know, mad, evil, rat, magic scientist. It's kind of crazy to hear that out loud. And then I'm going to go back to this Rune Fang silver for the little smaller bits on that metal part of his weapon. In 40k, I guess I'd call that a vox. God knows what the rats call it. Now to paint the cords that go to both his weapon and his gun, I'm going to use this Griff Charger Gray. It's going to give us a nice dark color. It's not quite black, to make these cords kind of interesting because they are, you know, out in front of the model and kind of prominent. There are a lot of little bits on this model, and trying to give them all the due process they deserve. For the wraps on both his weapon and on the cords of the gun, I'm going to use this Trooper White. It's kind of an off-white color that I really like. I really hate GW's whites, Games Workshop's. I mean, all of them are just awful, but Trooper White is a really nice white color that's, you know, a little off-white, that you might want to look into. But I'm going to do my wraps this way, and then I'll grunge them up later with some Agrex Earthshade or something else to make it look, you know, dirty and fitting of a rat. I wonder if GW gets fined for not putting any skulls on their models. This one has one too, as a little ornament on his weapon, and I'm just going to do a base coat of Screaming Skull, and then we'll, you know, end up doing a wash to make it dirty, and then going back over with Screaming Skull, excuse me, which I do think leaves a nice, good color on GW skeletons. Kind of going backwards here, but like I said, I was making this up as I went along. Originally I was going to do his shoulder pads a different color, but ultimately I decided it looked best if it just matched the rest of his body armor. So we brought out the Balthazar gold and are doing the shoulder armor plates that I missed earlier. For the stock on his gun, I kind of want to use a lighter wood color, but still it's very textured and interesting with grain, so contrast paint's a good choice here. So I went with Skeleton Horde by GW Contrast Paints. And it's just going to give us a nice color, and with the texture already on the model, those grain lines are going to show through, and then of course we can amplify them a little bit later with a lighter highlight color. Probably a dry brush over this stock really. For the metal parts of this gun, I'm going to go back to my Rune Fang steel and get all these metal edges that are still on the model, but not the scope. We'll do that darker color. Doing the Rune Fang on this part just makes that contrast a little bit more with the Iron Warriors we did for the barrel. You know, contrast is good, especially on miniatures. It just makes things stand out more, which might be hard on the smaller scale. And then for the flintlock, I'm going to use this Hosset copper, Hosshut, whatever, the Chaos Dwarf, god dude. And it's just going to make it stand out just a little bit more. For the scope, we're just going to use some Black Templar contrast paint here. I do like the scope to be a dark color, but it's going to need some contrasting a little bit later. Because even though Black Templar is a contrast paint, it's still black, and so it doesn't do the depth, the highlights and lowlights very well, so it's going to need a little help later, but this is a nice base coat to start with. I'm going to do some lead belcher here for his bracers. They'll just add another metallic tone for his armor. And of course, by the time it's over, I'm going to make sure it's a little gritty and dirty. We're definitely going to do a lot of wash with Earthshade here, but it just adds another different kind of metal to his body, a little bit more interest between the copper, you know, the bronze, the blue, and now this. This bit is going to be hard to see, but we're going to use this contrast paint from GW to do the inside of his mouth. With the Zenithal shading, it's already pretty dark in there, so this contrast paint will give us a nice, dark, fairly realistic color for very little effort for the inside of his mouth. So now I'm going to do this Corvus Black for his nails on his feet. To be honest, I didn't know what color to do these. And when in doubt, a dark color seems to work pretty fine. These actually might be a little too dark. I think if I did it again, maybe I would have gone a base coat of Eshin Gray. But by the time this is over and it's highlighted and it's washed, it still looks pretty good. This model has some weird bulbs in a few places that I don't understand what they do. Apparently I'm no rat scientist, but I'm just going to hype up the Warpstone aspect of this model and make him green, make him kind of eerie, and seem to be, you know, part of the evil rat science. Now I'm going to take just a little bit of Ushabti bone, and that's what I'm going to use as a base layer for his teeth, his fangs, whatever you want to call them, and his mouth. And so for a warp block engineer, the Warpstone is going to be a big focal point of the unit, so you got to get that right. I'm going to start out with this base of this Hexwraith Flame. This is a newer paint by GW. I think they made it with their Soul Blight in mind, with doing ghosts and stuff, but this is going to help give a eerie green glow to these stones, and it's going to make a good base coat for what we want to do here. So now I'm painting the backpack of this model. I'm starting with the base coat, this Hasset Copper. The idea is to do this brighter than I did the armor on the body, so it's just a little differentiated, not quite the same. I know this is really bright, but we are going to darken this up with some Agrax Earthshade later, so we'll make it look more grimy. But for now, we're just going to get a nice thin coat of this Hasset Copper onto this backpack, and we're going to avoid this, you know, the Skaven symbol seal at the very tip. We're going to avoid the welding that puts the two pieces together. We're going to do those in a different color. Next, we're going back to this Rune Fang steel, this brighter silver metallic, and I'm gonna do the welded parts of the backpack where it comes together. We're also gonna do a base coat of the rune in this color as well, for just a little bit of nice contrast. So now I'm doing the cables on the back of this miniature, and I'm going to do this a little bit different than we did the other ones. We're going to go every other tube cable in this color, and the other ones we're going to give more of a warp glow effect to fit in with the Skaven theme. And then a little Hexwraith Flame for the other two tubes. I think overall this is going to add some character to his backpack piece, make it look more like an active thing in his, you know, mad warp, sorcery, engineering, whatever. Now I'm going back to this contrast pink color. I'm going to dilute it down about 50-50 with some contrast medium, and I'm just going to go over a bit of his tail and a bit of his nose, not the full tail, but you know, just a bit of it. Give more of a pinkish hue that you'd see on a natural rat for nose and tail. A lot of details with this model. It's taken a lot of time, but we're nearing the finish line. We're going to start doing some washes. I'm going to take some Agrax Earthshade, and I am going to go over all of our copper bits on both his armor plates and his backpack piece, whatever the official name of that is. With GW, who knows? Warp pack, Doom pack, Edgy name pack. It's all on the table. I'm also going to go back and hit the wraps with this color and the cables on the gun and weapon just to add a little bit of dirt. Rat shouldn't be clean. I do want to hype up the filthy look to him. Then we'll go ahead and hit the skeleton with the coat as well. And finally, let's get these robes nice and dirty. Again, with the Earth Shade, nobody wants to see a clean rat on the tabletop. They come from underground, they come from the sewers. We want them kind of grimy, dingy. So we're careful with anytime we're using a bright color like blue to always brunch it up afterwards. And also be careful of the pulling here. You don't want to pull too much. We want the robes to be dirty, but we don't want to look like he's carrying a mud puddle mid-robe. So just be mindful of how it's pulling while you do this. So now I'm going to hit other parts of this model with a little bit of Nuln Oil, starting with the gun. Nuln Oil is just a really great shade with a lot of different uses. For this model, we're mostly going to hit places where we did the more silver metallics metal, including the gun, and a few other places just to add a little bit of depth to the model. When going over the weapon, just be careful about the runes. We're going to do something else with them. We don't want to get them too dark. That's just going to dilute our warp glow effect later. I'm also going to try to get in between these tubes here on his back piece, just to add a little bit of depth of shadow and make it look more realistic. And finally, I'm going to hit the weld here on the back piece. I went a little too heavy right here. You can see where it's pulling a bit at the top. I'm going to have to go back and fix that. It's just not going to be a very good look for the finished model. The good news is these dry fairly slowly, so you have a chance to clean things up. Finally, I'm just going to carefully add a little bit of shadow to this emblem on the back. We're going to stick to the outside because on the inside, I'm going to give it a Warpstone glow here in a second. So last thing I'm going to do before highlighting, I'm going to take some more Dawnstone, a little bit of Agrax Earthshade, and I'm just going to paint the rock he's standing on. This rat's for a friend. I don't really know what base he's doing. He's, across the country, so I'm going to do this rock. I'm going to leave the rest as it is and let him deal with to make it match his armor the best, but I figured this rock is probably fair game to paint, and it'll look a little better if I get this done. He won't have to fight and get in to the model's feet when he gets it, where he's at. So yeah, not too much here. A little bit of Dawnstone, probably some Agrax Earthshade to make it look a little dirty. And then we'll move on to highlighting. Okay, for our first highlight, I'm back with the the Dawnstone and the dry brush, I'm just going to give a light dry brush to the scope of the gun, make it look a little worn, and you know, just break up the black a little bit, make its edges stand out. It's just a light dry brush trying to avoid the rest of the gun, and then we'll move on. Sticking with the Dawnstone, because we already have it out, I'm going to switch back to a smaller, more precise paintbrush, and I'm going to carefully highlight the fur on his face. Anywhere we see a defined line, we want to get a thin layer of Dawnstone on it, which will make this fur pop out a little bit more so it doesn't blend quite so easily together. Just very carefully make these lines across both sides of his face. Doing my best to be very precise here. I don't have a lot of paint on the brush. I don't want big sloppy lines. I want it thin. If you have shaky hands, and I quite honestly do, you could use your little model holder, this figure holder that I have right here, as kind of you know, a rest to put your hand on. Makes it less shaky. You can do steadier lines this way, but mostly it just takes practice, and you know, take your time, be slow. Take a deep breath, you can get it done. Be sure to catch the top of his ears, because those are also on the fur, and do the other side of his face, and then we'll move on. So next I'm going to take some mithril blade from Two Thin Coats, and I'm going to hit all of our more silvery metallics, obviously not getting the copper, excuse me, but getting all the metallics, including the iron warriors we use for the helm. You're going to get a real strong contrast here because that original metal was so dark, but I think that's going to look really nice. It's going to make it pop. Same thing with the barrel of the gun. It's a darker metal, and this is a, you know, opposite of the spectrum, but I think ultimately it's going to look really good. Similar to doing the face, we want just smooth, steady lines. We're using the miniature holder as a brace so we can get steady hands. We just have a little bit on the paintbrush, and we're utilizing the side rather than the point so we can have a nice, steady line and be in total control. We're going slow, we're taking our time, and it's going to pay dividends in the end. Don't forget to highlight the bracers, like the gun barrel and his helm. We have a really dark metal here, so doing these highlights on the edges and on that spike in the middle, it's just really gonna pop, make the miniature look nice. I'm real happy with how this turned out. We are just being real careful not to miss any edge, and make sure we get every, you know, corner, every edge highlighted that we need to highlight, and then we'll move on. If you haven't painted a lot of models before watching this video, this step might be a little frustrating. I know my first time highlighting models way back when I did a Dark Angels army, it was frustrating. It was hard. It was hard to keep the highlight edges small and straight, you know, without being blotchy, but it's just a practice thing. And eventually you'll get to the point where you can make some really solid highlights and make your models look really nice. We're going to move on here. Using the same color, we're going to focus on the weapon. I'm just going to use the flat of my brush, and anywhere I want light to reflect on that bulbous part of the weapon, I'm just going to just give a little back and forth with my color there to look like light reflecting. And then we're going to hit the rest of this weapon. We're being very careful to hit the edges, but we don't want to go too deep. And we're going to avoid the runes on the weapon for now. We have plans for that later. Now we're taking some Hasset copper. Pretty sure that's how you pronounce that. Whatever. The Chaos Dwarf's God. It's copper. And now all of our bronze copper pieces, we're gonna highlight with this color. Even the places where we base coated in this Hosset copper, we darkened down a little bit with the Agri Earth shade before, so we're gonna go back and highlight those again to make some of the raised areas pop, like I'm doing right here to these rods on the backpack. We are just picking out places that are raised, places of interest to add just a little bit of color here. So make it pop a little bit more, make it stand out. These highlights can be subtle, but when you take in the miniature as a whole, they add a lot to it. And honestly, improving your painting from this point to what I'm showing you is really just being able to add more layers of highlights and a little bit of blending. But mastering these highlights is just so much of getting quality miniatures onto the tabletop. Just going to be careful around these eyes to only hit the raised area. Let the lower layer stay dark. The known oil we shaded with, the Agrex we shaded with in the original color, and just hit the raised points with this to make those little eye guards stand out a little bit more. Between that and the Iron Warriors of the helmet and the gray skin, I mean, it's all dark here, but the highlights make it pop, make it stand out, make it look gritty, but really good. Same color, we're just going to be very careful to edge the plates of his armor now. This can be a little bit tricky, especially in the front where the pads come together, but we're just going to be slow. We're going to take our time. And worst case scenario, if your line gets a little big, a little splotchy, you paint over it again with your original color, the Balthazar gold, and you wash it again and you give another shot. A lot of miniature painting is just having the patience to do things over and over again until you think you got it right. So now I'm using Kislev flesh, and this is how I'm going to, well, highlight the flesh. There's just a little bit around his mouth. Gotta be a little careful. We don't want to paint over where we have fur. We just want to hit the edges of the flesh of his mouth and of his hands to make those pop a little bit. So here I actually started with the tail, which we have the highlight too, and I just very carefully hit the higher parts of the tail, the ones that face up would hit the most lights. Then we're going to move on to his hands here, feet, and face. And don't forget the fleshy part of the ears. So again, very careful, just a very small amount of paint. I just want to get that line of his lips on his open mouth, make that stand out a little bit more. Big breath, take your time, you got this. And if not, you can always go back and fix your mistakes. It's one of the nice things about miniature painting. Now I'm going to quickly go back with Screaming Skull over, well, the skull we painted. We washed it with Agax Earthshade, we knocked it down a couple shades, we made it dirty, and now we're just going to hit those raised areas, make them pop a little bit. Now I'm going to take some Uriel yellow and I'm going to dry brush over the Warpstone. This will add the very highest, sharpest points of the Warpstone on his backpack as yellow. Kind of makes them look like they're crackling with energy. Just adds a nice effect to them. And it's very easy to implement. Moving on, we're going to add our warp glow effect to our runes on both our weapon and our backpack. We're going to use this Hex Wraith Flame. Going to get just a little bit onto our paintbrush, and we're going to very carefully put this stuff in the recesses of the runes we want. You're going to have a little bit on the brush, quite a bit, and we do kind of want to overflow a little bit to give it a glow effect. We're just going to be very carefully to keep the stuff where we want it. And we're going to do the same for these runes on the weapon. Again, it's okay to have a little bit of overflow, just not too much. We're going to make sure we get the depth of this weapon with this eerie green glow. And so it looks like we have some foul magic going on in the weapon of this rat. So here I made a big mistake with this oxidizing effect that GW produces. I've never used this before. I just assumed I could use it like a wash. I was mistaken on this. I covered the whole model here. Do not do what I did. But I am just going to record this. I'm going to show it just to share what I did and how I fixed it. But if you're doing this yourself, you just want to put this stuff only where you want it, maybe around the edges or places you want to shown wear, but do not cover everything like I did. It's just going to get everything in a little thin film that we then have to go back and correct. So then you're stuck with this mess. Luckily, fixing it is not too bad. I'm just going to go back with my base colors and I'm just going to hit those spots that I want to be, well, the original color. So we're going to leave the oxidizing effect around the edges and in the middle here and there. We just don't want to make it uniform to make it look more worn. And honestly, as we went back through, this saved the model pretty well. It looked pretty good at the end. You're going to have to do the same thing for the backpack. Just remember to switch over to Hasset Gold or Hasset Copper. And then we're going back with everything we just repaired with a little bit more of the Agrax Earthshade because we covered all that up. Again, you only have to do this if you mess up with the oxide. Otherwise, that will be your last step. And that's going to leave us with a finished model. And there we have it, my first rat. It was a fun little journey. We made some mistakes. We learned to fix some mistakes. There's a lot of details on this model. It's a really fun one if you get your hands on it. And if you made it this far, thanks for watching.